You don't belong here. How many times do people like you need to be told? The words didn't echo, they cut, sharp and deliberate, slicing through the polished silence of the marble lobby like something rehearsed, something familiar, and then came the sound, quick, shocking, not loud but loud enough to freeze movement, to turn heads, to pull every eye in the room toward the same moment where Danielle Carter stood still, her face calm, her posture unbroken, as if the air itself had paused around her. No scream followed, no outburst, just a stillness so controlled it felt heavier than anger, heavier than humiliation, the kind of stillness that made people uncomfortable because it didn't behave the way they expected. Before we continue, where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. And if you believe in dignity and justice, hit like and subscribe. These stories spark change. And we're glad you're here. Now, back to Danielle Carter. She hadn't come in looking like power, no designer labels, no security detail, no polished heels clicking against the floor to announce her presence, just dark jeans, a simple blouse, and a quiet confidence that didn't ask for attention but commanded it anyway if you knew how to see it. But they didn't see it, not here, not today, not in this lobby where perception mattered more than truth, where a white manager in a tailored suit stood behind a desk like a gatekeeper to a world Danielle had built brick by brick yet was now being told she couldn't enter. The guests nearby shifted, some pretending not to notice, others watching too closely, phones hovering just low enough to deny involvement but high enough to capture everything, because something about the moment felt wrong, unmistakably wrong, like watching a script unfold that everyone had seen before but hoped wouldn't repeat. Danielle's eyes didn't dart, didn't search for help, didn't betray even a flicker of panic. They stayed steady, locked not on the man in front of her but somewhere deeper, somewhere older, as if this moment wasn't new but an echo, a pattern repeating itself in a different room with different faces. The manager adjusted his cufflinks like nothing had happened, like the line hadn't been crossed, like authority could erase accountability if performed confidently enough. I suggest you leave before this gets worse, he added, voice smooth now controlled, as if the earlier tension could be softened by tone alone. But the room didn't relax, it tightened, because something in Danielle's silence didn't match submission, it didn't match defeat, it matched calculation. A young woman near the concierge desk whispered, barely audible, "This doesn't feel right," and that whisper carried further than expected, threading through the room, connecting glances, raising doubt. Because people weren't just watching anymore, they were starting to feel it, that shift, that subtle tilt where the story stops being about who looks powerful and starts being about who actually is. Danielle finally moved, not back, not away, but forward, just one step, measured, deliberate, reclaiming space without asking for it. And when she spoke, her voice wasn't loud, it didn't need to be, it landed with precision, calm and unshaken. You just made a decision you can't undo. And for the first time since the moment began, the manager hesitated, not visibly, not enough for everyone to notice, but enough for the room to feel it, that hairline-cracking confidence, that quiet realization that whatever he thought this moment was, he had just misread it completely. The lobby did not return to normal, it could not, because something invisible had shifted and everyone felt it even if they could not explain it, like the temperature had dropped without warning and the air carried a tension that refused to settle. And Danielle Carter stood in the center of it all with the same quiet posture, shoulders relaxed, chin level, eyes steady, not reacting the way the room expected, not shrinking, not apologizing, not explaining herself, and that alone began to unsettle people more than anything else that had already happened. The manager cleared his throat as if to reset control, as if the narrative could be rewritten simply by speaking louder or standing straighter. "You are causing a disturbance," he said, his voice now sharper, edged with irritation that betrayed the small fracture forming beneath his confidence. "This is a private property and we reserve the right to refuse service." But even as he said it, a few guests exchanged looks because something about that statement no longer sounded like authority, it sounded like justification. Behind the front desk, a young receptionist named Olivia hesitated, her fingers hovering above the keyboard, eyes flicking between Danielle and the manager, then back to the screen, because she had seen the reservation earlier that morning. She remembered the name, she remembered the system flag that did not appear for just anyone, and now doubt crept in, quiet but persistent. "Sir, maybe we should double-check the," she began, but the manager cut her off with a glance so sharp it silenced her mid-sentence. "There is nothing to check," he snapped, too quickly, too firmly, like someone trying to shut a door before anyone could see what was behind it. Danielle did not look at Olivia. She Did not need to, she could feel the shift happening around her, the subtle alignment of truth trying to surface in a room that had been trained to ignore it, and when she spoke again, her voice remained even, controlled, almost soft. You had every opportunity to handle this differently, she said, each word placed with intention, not rushed, not emotional, just precise, but you chose assumption over fact, and that word, assumption, hung in the air heavier than accusation because it named something deeper than the moment itself. A man near the elevators, dressed in a navy suit, lowered his phone slightly and said under his breath, he should probably run her name, and that suggestion, simple as it was, began to ripple outward, quiet agreement spreading in glances and murmurs, because the room was no longer convinced by confidence alone, it was starting to ask questions. The manager laughed, but it came out thinner than he intended. We do not verify guests based on demands, he replied, though no one had heard Danielle demand anything, and that inconsistency did not go unnoticed, not by Olivia, not by the guests, and not by Danielle, who finally reached into her pocket with a slow, deliberate motion, pulling out her phone, not hurried, not dramatic, just certain, and as the screen lit up in her hand, the movement itself drew attention, not because it was unusual, but because it felt like the beginning of something, like the moment before a switch is flipped and everything changes. She tapped once, then lifted the phone to her ear, her gaze never leaving the manager as she spoke, calm and direct. This is Danielle. Initiate internal review protocol, and there was a pause, just long enough for the words to register without explanation, long enough for the manager's expression to shift almost imperceptibly, because in that brief silence, the balance of power in the room began to tilt, not loudly, not dramatically, but undeniably, like gravity itself had chosen a different direction. The silence after her words did not feel empty, it felt loaded, like something unseen had just been set in motion and the room was waiting to catch up, and Danielle Carter lowered her hand slowly, the phone still resting against her ear for a second longer before she pulled it away, not in a hurry, not seeking attention, just allowing the moment to breathe as if she already knew how it would unfold. The manager shifted his weight. A small movement but enough to break the illusion of control he had been holding onto, his eyes narrowing slightly as he studied her now with something different than before, not just dismissal but uncertainty, the kind that creeps in when confidence meets something it cannot immediately explain. Who exactly do you think you are calling? He asked, his tone attempting to recover authority but missing its mark, because the question itself revealed more than it concealed. It showed that he did not know, and that not knowing was beginning to matter. Danielle did not answer right away, and that pause stretched longer than expected, long enough for the receptionist Olivia to glance back at her screen again, fingers moving this time despite the earlier warning, quietly navigating the system as if guided by instinct rather than permission, and within seconds her posture changed, her shoulders tightening, her eyes widening just slightly as she leaned closer to the monitor, because the name she saw was not just a reservation, it was flagged at a level she had never personally handled before, an internal designation that required executive clearance, and suddenly the room felt smaller to her, like she was standing inside a situation she did not fully understand but knew was far bigger than it appeared. Sir, she said again, more firmly now, unable to ignore it any longer, there is a profile in the system, it is marked priority executive access. And this time the manager did not immediately cut her off, because something in her tone carried weight, something that made interruption feel riskier than listening, but his hesitation came a second too late, because the words had already reached the room, already sparked the next wave of murmurs, already begun to shift perception from assumption to possibility. A guest near the seating area leaned forward slightly, whispering to the person beside him, executive access does not just appear, and that quiet observation spread faster than any raised voice could have, because it aligned with what people were starting to feel, that this moment was not what it seemed at first glance. Danielle finally spoke, her voice unchanged, still calm, still measured, but now carrying something heavier beneath it, something that did not need volume to be understood. You based everything on what you thought you saw, she said, her eyes steady on the manager, and ignored what was right in front of you, and the statement landed not as an argument but as a conclusion, like a door closing on the version of events he had been trying to maintain. The manager forced a smile, but it did not reach his eyes. Systems can be wrong, he replied, though even as he said it, his gaze flicked briefly toward the screen behind the desk, betraying a flicker of doubt he could not fully suppress, and that flicker did not go unnoticed, not by Olivia, not by the guests, and certainly not by Danielle, who took a single step closer to the desk, not aggressive, not confrontational, just enough to narrow the distance, to make the moment more direct, more undeniable, and then her phone buzzed softly in her hand. A single vibration that seemed louder than it should have been in the quiet tension of the lobby, and when she glanced down at the screen, her expression did not change, but something in her posture settled even further, as if confirmation had just arrived exactly when expected, and she lifted her eyes back to the manager and said, quietly but with absolute clarity, "They are already reviewing everything," and in that instant, the balance of power did not just shift, it began to tip. The word settled into the room like a quiet verdict, and for a moment no one moved, not the guests, not the receptionist, not even the manager, who now stood with a stiffness that no longer looked like authority but like resistance, the kind that comes when reality begins to push back against a narrative that can no longer hold. Danielle Carter did not shift her stance, did not repeat herself, did not raise her voice, she simply waited, and that waiting carried more pressure than any confrontation could have, because it forced the moment to unfold without interference, without distraction, without escape. Behind the desk, Olivia's fingers moved faster now, no longer hesitant, pulling up deeper layers of the system, her eyes scanning across lines of information she had never been trained to interpret but could not ignore, and then it happened. A subtle but unmistakable change on the screen, a series of access logs lighting up in real time, timestamps appearing one after another, and her breath caught slightly as she realized these were not old records, they were live, being updated second by second, as if someone somewhere else was already inside the system, already watching, already documenting. "Sir," she said again, but this time her voice did not ask for permission, it carried urgency. "There is an active audit running." And that phrase did something the earlier ones had not, it reached beyond confusion and into consequence, because an audit did not suggest possibility, it confirmed action. The manager turned toward her sharply, his composure cracking just enough to reveal the pressure underneath. "Stop digging into things you do not understand," he said, but the edge in his voice no longer sounded controlled, it sounded defensive, and the room heard it, felt it, recognized it for what it was, a shift from command to reaction. A guest near the entrance took a slow step closer, lowering his phone just enough to speak quietly but clearly. If there is an audit, then someone higher up is already involved, and that simple observation moved through the space like a current, connecting people who had been silent until now, aligning them not with Danielle as a person, but with the idea that something real was happening beyond what they could see. Danielle's gaze remained steady, but her presence changed, not in appearance, not in posture, but in weight, as if the room itself had begun to orbit around her rather than the desk, and when she spoke again, her voice carried the same calm precision, but now it held finality. "Every word, every action, every decision made in the last 10 minutes is being recorded and reviewed," she said, and she did not need to explain by whom, because the system itself was already answering that question. The manager exhaled through his nose, a controlled motion meant to steady himself, but his eyes flicked once more toward the screen, toward Olivia, toward the growing awareness in the room that he could no longer contain, and in that glance, something else slipped through, something closer to realization than denial. Danielle took another small step forward, closing the space completely now, not invading, not confronting, just standing exactly where she chose to stand, and for the first time since the moment began. The manager did not immediately respond, because whatever he had believed about this situation was no longer enough to explain what was happening, and Danielle, watching him carefully, delivered the sentence that sealed it, quiet, unwavering, impossible to misinterpret. "You are not in control of this anymore," and this time, no one in the room questioned it. The room did not just feel different now, it behaved differently, like every movement carried meaning and every silence held weight, and Danielle Carter stood at the center of it with a presence that no longer needed to prove itself because the system around her was beginning to do that for her, piece by piece, second by second. Behind the desk, Olivia leaned closer to the monitor, her voice lowering but sharpening at the same time as she read what was unfolding in real time. "There are multiple access points connected, corporate level, compliance review, and an executive authorization," she said, each phrase landing heavier than the last, because these were not features of a normal guest profile, these were layers reserved for people who did not just stay in the building, but controlled what happened inside it. A quiet murmur spread again, but this time it was not curiosity, it was recognition. The kind that comes when people begin to realize they are witnessing something they were not meant to see, something that exposes more than just one moment, more than just one person's mistake. The manager's jaw tightened, his posture stiffening as if holding on to the last fragments of authority that still felt within reach. Systems can escalate errors just as quickly as they create them, he said, but the confidence in his voice had thinned, stretched too far to sound convincing. And even he seemed to hear it as soon as the words left his mouth. Danielle did not respond. Immediately, she allowed the statement to settle, to reveal itself for what it was, not control, not leadership, but resistance, and then she tilted her head slightly, just enough to acknowledge the distance between what he believed and what was actually happening. You are still trying to explain this away, she said quietly, not accusing, not emotional, simply stating a fact that the room could now feel as clearly as she did. Near the seating area, the same young woman who had spoken earlier stepped forward just a little, her voice steadier now. If this is corporate level, then someone higher than all of us is already watching, she said, and this time no one dismissed her, because the evidence was no longer subtle, it was visible, active, undeniable. Olivia's screen updated again, a soft alert tone barely audible but enough to draw attention, and her eyes widened as a new line appeared across the system, a message that was not meant for guests but now sat in front of her anyway, clear and direct, internal review locked, personnel actions pending, and she swallowed before speaking. Sir, it says personnel status is being evaluated, live, and that word, live, cut through whatever control the manager thought he still had left, because it meant this was not something that could be delayed, not something that could be spun, not something that could be hidden. Danielle took a slow breath, not out of stress but out of certainty, and for the first time since she had walked into the lobby, there was a subtle shift in her expression, not satisfaction, not anger, but resolution, as if the outcome she had expected was now arriving exactly on schedule. She looked directly at the manager, her voice steady, calm, and absolute. You had 9 minutes to choose professionalism, she said, each word landing with quiet precision, and you chose something else, and the sentence did not rise, did not fall, it simply existed in the space between them like a final measurement of everything that had just happened. The manager opened his mouth as if to respond, but nothing came out right away. Because for the first time he was not deciding what to say next, he was realizing that whatever came next might not be his decision at all, and Danielle, watching him carefully, added one last line that sealed the moment before it fully turned. Now the system is choosing for you. The moment did not explode, it tightened, like a wire being pulled 1 inch at a time until it could not hold any more, and Danielle Carter stood unmoved at the center of it while the system around her continued to respond in ways no one in the room could control, predict, or stop. Behind the desk, Olivia's screen flickered again, not dramatically but enough to draw her full attention, and then a new alert appeared, not buried in data, not hidden in layers, but bold, direct, unmistakable. A system-wide notification that overrode everything else on her display. Access privileges under review, managerial credentials flagged, pending authorization from executive command, and her breath caught again, sharper this time, because this was no longer about observation, this was action. Sir, she said, her voice no longer uncertain, no longer hesitant, but carrying a clarity that cut through the room. Your credentials are being flagged right now. And the words landed with a finality that no explanation could soften, because flagged meant watched. And watched meant accountable. The manager's face changed, not all at once, but in pieces, first the eyes narrowing, then the jaw tightening, then the subtle shift in posture that no longer projected control but braced for impact. That is not possible, he said quickly, too quickly, stepping toward the desk as if proximity alone could reverse what was happening. There must be a system error, but even as he said it, his hand hovered near the terminal without touching it, as if some part of him already knew that whatever he might try would not restore what had been lost. A guest near the center of the lobby let out a quiet breath and said, almost to himself, that does not happen unless someone at the very top is involved, and the statement spread without needing repetition, because the evidence was now visible to everyone, not just in words, but in reactions, in the way the manager no longer commanded the room, in the way Olivia no longer waited for permission, in the way Danielle did not move at all. Danielle watched him carefully, not with anger, not with satisfaction, but with a steady awareness that felt almost clinical, like she was observing a process she had seen before, and when she spoke, her voice remained even, grounded, carrying none of the tension that filled the space around her. You are still hoping this is temporary, she said, and the truth of that statement settled immediately, because it named exactly what he was holding on to, the belief that this moment would pass, that control would return, that authority could be reclaimed. the manager swallowed, a small, involuntary motion that broke whatever composure he had left, and for the first time he looked directly at Danielle, not as someone to dismiss, not as someone to remove, but as someone he did not understand. And that lack of understanding had become the most dangerous part of the situation. Olivia's screen updated again, another tone, sharper this time, and she leaned back slightly as if the information itself carried weight. Executive override confirmed, she read aloud, almost without meaning to. Origin. Danielle Carter, and the room did not just go quiet, it locked, every sound pulled inward, every movement paused, because the name that had been spoken was no longer just a name in the system, it was now connected to the person standing in front of them. Danielle did not react to the revelation, she did not need to, because the room reacted for her, and in that silence she took one final step forward, closing the distance completely, her voice calm, precise, and undeniable as she delivered the sentence that transformed everything from confusion into clarity. You did not just misjudge a guest, she said, her eyes steady on his, you misjudged the person who signs your employment records, and this time, no one in the room questioned it, not even him. For a brief second, the room stopped being a lobby and became something else entirely, not quite a courtroom, not quite a stage, but a place where truth had just stepped forward and refused to leave, and Danielle Carter did not move, did not adjust her posture, did not look around for reactions, because she did not need confirmation, the system had already spoken for her. The manager stood frozen, not dramatically, not visibly collapsing, but caught in that narrow space between denial and realization where the mind tries to catch up to what has already happened, his eyes shifting from Danielle to the screen, then back again, as if repeating the motion might somehow change what he was seeing. That is not possible, he said again, but this time the words sounded different, thinner, like something borrowed rather than believed. Olivia did not respond to him, not immediately, because her attention was locked on the terminal, where the system continued to update without pause, line after line appearing with a precision that felt almost intentional, as if every second was being documented for a reason, and then another alert surfaced, not subtle, not buried, but direct and unmistakable, executive ownership verified, and she inhaled sharply before reading it aloud, unable to stop herself. Ownership status confirmed, primary stakeholder. Danielle Carter, and the name did not echo, it settled, heavy and final, because it no longer required interpretation. A low murmur rolled through the guests, not loud, not chaotic, but unified, the kind of sound that comes when multiple people arrive at the same conclusion at the same time, and a man near the back shook his head slowly, whispering, he really did not know, while another voice followed, quieter but sharper, that is the problem. He never asked. The manager took a small step back, barely noticeable, but enough to break the illusion of control completely, his shoulders no longer squared, his stance no longer anchored, and for the first time since Danielle had entered the building, he looked uncertain in a way that could not be hidden behind tone or posture. If this is some kind of misunderstanding, he began, but the sentence did not finish, because even he seemed to recognize that the word misunderstanding no longer fit the situation. Danielle watched him with the same calm focus she had held from the beginning, but now there was something else beneath it, not anger, not triumph, but clarity, the kind that comes when a long pattern finally reaches its end point, and when she spoke, her voice carried that clarity without effort. You had access to the same information, she said, each word measured, each one deliberate, but you chose to ignore it, and the statement did not accuse, it explained. It placed responsibility exactly where it belonged without raising the volume or shifting the tone. Olivia stepped back slightly from the desk, as if the space itself had changed ownership in front of her eyes, her gaze moving from the screen to Danielle with a new understanding, not just of who she was, but of what had just unfolded, and she said quietly, almost to herself, this was never about verification, and that realization hung in the air longer than anything else, because it named the truth no one had wanted to say out loud. Danielle took a slow breath, her posture unchanged, her presence steady, and then she looked directly at the manager one more time, her voice calm, firm, and absolute as she delivered the line that closed the distance between assumption and reality completely. You decided who I was before you ever checked who I am, and in that moment, there was nothing left in the room that could contradict her. The room did not erupt after the truth landed, it narrowed, like everything unnecessary had been stripped away, leaving only what mattered, and Danielle Carter stood at the center of that clarity with a stillness that no longer felt quiet but absolute, the kind of presence that did not need to raise its voice because everything around it had already lowered. The manager's eyes moved again, but slower now, no longer searching for an angle, No longer trying to regain control, just trying to understand how quickly the ground beneath him had shifted, how something he had dismissed minutes ago now defined the entire room, and he opened his mouth once more, but this time the words did not come out with force, they came out uncertain, if there has been a mistake in how this was handled, and the sentence trailed, unfinished, because even he could hear how late it sounded, how far behind the moment it had fallen. Danielle did not interrupt him, she did not need to, because the room itself had already begun to respond in ways that made his position smaller by the second, a guest near the front desk shaking his head slowly, another stepping closer not to escalate but to witness, to confirm what they were seeing, to be part of the moment where something was finally being addressed instead of ignored. Behind the desk, Olivia straightened, no longer hovering uncertainly but standing with a quiet firmness that mirrored Danielle's own. Her hands no longer frozen above the keyboard but resting with intention as she watched the system continue to update, and then another notification appeared, sharper, final, managerial access suspended, and she exhaled softly before saying it out loud, not as a question, not as a warning, but as a fact, your system access has been revoked, and the words did not echo, they settled, because they marked a point that could not be undone. The manager blinked once, then again, as if trying to process the sentence through a reality that no longer matched it, his posture shifting not dramatically but undeniably, shoulders lowering, stance loosening, authority no longer something he could perform but something that had been removed entirely, and for the first time, he did not try to correct anyone, he did not raise his voice, he did not assert control. He simply stood there, caught in the moment he had created. Danielle watched him, her expression unchanged, but her presence now carried a different weight, not anticipation, not tension, but resolution, as if everything that needed to happen was now happening exactly as it should, and when she spoke again, her voice was steady, composed, and unmistakably final. This was never about one interaction, she said, each word placed carefully, this is about a pattern you thought no one was watching. And that sentence did not just address him, it addressed the room, the witnesses, the system itself, tying everything together into a single truth that could no longer be separated or denied. A quiet voice from the side added, almost in disbelief, he lost everything in minutes, and another responded just as quietly, no, he revealed it, and that distinction lingered, because it reframed the entire moment not as something sudden, but as something inevitable. Danielle took one slow step back, not retreating, not disengaging, but allowing the space to shift again, to settle into its new reality, and as she looked at the manager one last time in that moment, her voice remained calm, controlled, and precise, delivering the line that closed the gap between action and consequence completely. You were never removed from power, she said, her eyes steady, you just showed everyone you should not have had it. The lobby did not return to its former rhythm, it could not, because something fundamental had been exposed and once seen it could not be unseen. And Danielle Carter stood with the same composed stillness as the system continued to move around her, not loudly, not chaotically, but with a precision that made every second feel deliberate. Behind the desk, Olivia's screen shifted again, a new panel opening automatically without her input. And this time the text was unmistakable, personnel action authorized, termination sequence pending confirmation, and she drew in a slow breath before speaking. Her voice steady but carrying the weight of what she was reading. There is a termination authorization request in the system, and the words did not need to be repeated, they settled instantly, because everyone understood what they meant. The manager's head turned sharply toward her, his composure now fractured beyond repair. That cannot be processed without executive approval, he said, but the statement sounded less like a fact and more like a hope, something he was trying to hold on to as everything else slipped away. Danielle did not raise her voice, did not step forward, did not gesture, she simply looked at him with a calm that no longer felt passive but definitive, and when she spoke, her tone carried the same quiet authority that had guided every moment since she entered. It already has been, she said, and the simplicity of the statement removed any space left for doubt. A soft vibration came from Olivia's terminal, followed by a confirmation tone that echoed just enough to mark the transition from process to outcome, and she read the next line without hesitation, managerial role terminated, effective immediately. And this time the room reacted, not loudly, not dramatically, but with a collective shift, a visible realignment of understanding as the final layer of authority was removed in real time. The manager blinked, his expression caught between disbelief and realization. His stance no longer anchored, no longer supported by position or title, and for a moment he looked not at Danielle, not at the guests, but at the desk itself, as if trying to locate the version of himself that had stood there minutes ago, the one who believed he controlled what happened in this space. A guest near the elevators exhaled slowly and said, almost in awe, "It really happens like that," and another voice followed quietly, not suddenly, just finally, and those words carried through the room, reframing everything once more, because what had just occurred was not random. It was the result of choices made openly, witnessed clearly, and now answered directly. Danielle allowed a brief pause, not to create tension, but to acknowledge completion, to let the moment settle into its full weight before moving forward, and then she shifted her gaze slightly, not just at the manager, but at the entire front desk, at the system, at the structure that had allowed the moment to happen in the first place. And when she spoke again, her voice remained calm, but now it carried something broader, something that extended beyond one person. "This is not about one position," she said, each word deliberate. "It is about accountability across every level," and the statement did not rise, did not fall, it simply defined the next phase of what was unfolding. Olivia's screen responded again, new names appearing beneath the managers. Flagged, reviewed, pending, and she swallowed before speaking once more, quieter this time but no less clear. "There are additional personnel under review," and the implication moved through the room instantly, because it meant the moment was not over, it was expanding. Danielle looked forward again, her posture unchanged, her presence steady, and delivered the line that marked the transition from consequence to correction. "When a system fails at the front, it does not stop at the front," she said, her voice precise and unwavering. "It gets rebuilt from the inside." The shift did not stop with one name, it spread quietly, methodically, like a system correcting itself in real time, and Danielle Carter stood with the same composed stillness as the lobby continued to transform around her, not through noise or chaos, but through precision, through structure, through a level of control that did not need to announce itself because it was already in effect. Behind the desk, Olivia's screen updated again, a cascade of internal actions appearing one after another, each line confirming that what had begun as a single incident was now being processed as a broader failure, and she read carefully, her voice steady despite the weight of what she was seeing. 2 additional staff accounts flagged for review, access levels restricted pending compliance verification, and the words carried further than expected, not because they were loud, but because they were final. The remaining staff at the desk exchanged brief, tense glances, not speaking, not reacting outwardly, but clearly understanding that the moment had moved beyond one person, beyond one mistake, into something that touched all of them, and that realization settled into their posture, into the way they stood, into the silence they did not break. Danielle shifted her gaze slightly, taking in the entire front desk now, not focusing on one individual but on the structure itself, and her expression remained calm, not cold, not distant, but resolute, as if she was measuring not just what had happened, but what needed to change moving forward. The former manager stood off to the side now, no longer positioned behind the desk, no longer the center of authority, his presence reduced not by force but by process, by the quiet removal of access, of control, of recognition, and he did not speak again, because there was nothing left to say that could alter what had already been decided. A guest near the entrance took a slow breath and said, almost in disbelief, "This is happening in real time," and another responded just as quietly, "This is what accountability looks like," and the exchange did not feel like commentary, it felt like acknowledgement, like the room itself was learning something it had not expected to witness. Olivia's terminal chimed again, a softer tone this time, and a new message appeared, compliance directive issued, interim supervision assigned, and she looked up from the screen toward Danielle with a clarity that had not been there before, a recognition not just of authority, but of leadership, of presence, of something that extended beyond title or position. Danielle took a small step forward, not reclaiming space but redefining it, and when she spoke, her voice carried the same steady cadence, the same measured control that had shaped every moment since she arrived, but now it held something broader, something that addressed not just the past few minutes, but the system as a whole. "This is not about punishment," she said, each word deliberate, "it is about correction," and the statement did not soften what had happened, it clarified it, it reframed it as necessary, as inevitable, as part of something larger than individual consequence. The room remained quiet, but it was no longer tense, it was attentive, focused, as if every person present understood that they were witnessing not just the end of something, but the beginning of something else, something more deliberate, more accountable, more aware. Danielle paused for a brief moment, allowing the weight of her words to settle fully before continuing, her voice calm, unwavering, and precise. "Standards are not defined by comfort," she said, her gaze moving across the room, meeting eyes without effort. They're defined by how you treat someone when you think it does not matter, and the sentence landed with a clarity that needed no explanation, because everyone in the room now understood exactly what it meant, and more importantly, why it mattered. The room no longer questioned what was happening, it accepted it, not with applause or dramatic reaction, but with a quiet, collective understanding that something necessary had just unfolded in front of them, and Danielle Carter stood at the center of it with the same composed presence, not seeking recognition, not acknowledging the shift, simply allowing it to exist as it was. Behind the desk, Olivia adjusted her posture slightly, no longer reacting to each system update with surprise, but following it with focus, with intention, as if she had stepped into a different role without being told. And the terminal responded again, another sequence completing, additional access restrictions confirmed, compliance escalation logged, and she read it out clearly, not hesitating. All flagged accounts have now been restricted pending full review. And the words carried a finality that settled into the space like a conclusion that could not be reversed. The remaining staff stood still, their earlier confidence replaced not by fear, but by awareness, the kind that comes when assumptions are replaced by facts, when silence is replaced by consequence, and no one attempted to interrupt, no one attempted to explain, because the moment had moved beyond explanation. The former manager remained off to the side, no longer part of the structure, his presence now separate from the system that had once defined him. And for the first time since everything began, he looked not at Danielle, not at the guests, but at the floor, as if searching for something that had already been removed, something that could not be restored by acknowledgement alone. A guest near the concierge desk spoke quietly, almost reflective. She did not raise her voice once, and another answered. She did not need to, and that exchange lingered, because it captured something deeper than the surface of what had happened, something about control, about certainty, about the kind of authority that does not rely on volume. Danielle took a slow step forward again, not to reclaim attention, but to close the moment properly, to define its end as clearly as its beginning. And when she spoke, her voice remained steady, calm, and precise, carrying the same tone that had guided every shift in the room. This environment is not built on assumptions, she said, her gaze moving across the desk, across the staff, across the space itself. It is built on standards, and the sentence did not challenge, it established. It placed a boundary that did not need enforcement because it had already been demonstrated. Olivia nodded slightly, almost instinctively, her hands resting on the desk with a new steadiness, a new understanding of what her role required, and the system responded once more. Final compliance note logged. Interim operation secured, and she spoke again, quieter now but with complete clarity. Operations have been stabilized, and the phrase did not just describe the system, it described the room. The shift from tension to order, from confusion to clarity. Danielle allowed a brief pause, not to create effect, but to acknowledge completion, to let the moment settle into its final form, and then she looked once more toward the former manager, not with anger, not with judgment, but with a calm finality that closed the distance between action and consequence completely. You were given responsibility, she said, her voice even, unwavering, and you chose bias over judgment, and the words did not rise, did not fall, they simply remained, marking the end of what had been and the beginning of what would not be allowed to continue. The lobby had settled into a new kind of silence, not the uneasy quiet from before, but something steadier, more grounded, as if the space itself had realigned around a standard that could no longer be ignored. And Danielle Carter stood with the same calm presence, no urgency in her movements, no need to assert anything further because everything that needed to be proven had already been demonstrated in full view. The system behind the desk no longer flickered with uncertainty, it moved with completion, each process closing, each review locking into place, and Olivia watched the final sequence unfold with a focus that had replaced every trace of hesitation, her voice clear as she read the concluding update. All actions finalized, full compliance report submitted to corporate oversight, and the words carried a sense of closure that the entire room could feel. The remaining staff stood quieter now, not out of fear but out of recognition. Their earlier assumptions replaced with a clarity that left no room for misunderstanding, and no one attempted to justify what had happened, because justification no longer fit the reality in front of them. A guest near the seating area let out a slow breath and said softly, "That is how leadership looks," and another nodded, adding, "Not loud, just undeniable," and those words moved through the room without resistance, because they reflected exactly what had been witnessed, something controlled, something deliberate, something that did not rely on force to be effective. Danielle shifted her gaze across the space one final time, not scanning for approval, not acknowledging the attention, but simply observing the environment as it now stood, corrected, stabilized, accountable, and when she spoke again, her voice remained even, calm, and precise, carrying a tone that did not demand agreement but established understanding. "This place represents more than service," she said, each word measured. "It represents trust," and the statement settled into the room with weight, because trust was not something that could be assumed, it had to be maintained, protected, and proven. Olivia nodded slightly again, her posture now fully aligned with the role she had stepped into, her hand steady on the desk, her focus clear, and the system reflected that same stability. No new alerts, no pending actions, only confirmation that operations were secure and under proper oversight. Danielle allowed a brief pause, acknowledging the stillness that had replaced the earlier tension, and then she turned slightly, not away from the situation but forward from it, signaling that what had needed to happen was complete. And as she took a step, her voice carried one final statement, calm, firm, and unmistakably clear. "Respect is not something you offer when it is convenient," she said, her gaze steady. "It is something you uphold at all times," and the sentence did not rise, did not fall, it simply remained, marking the standard that now defined the space. The former manager did not respond, did not interrupt, did not attempt to reclaim anything, because there was nothing left to reclaim, and the room did not look to him anymore. It looked forward, following the shift that had already taken place. Danielle continued walking with the same measured pace, not rushed, not delayed, just certain, and as she moved through the lobby, the space held its new order, not because it was enforced, but because it had been established in a way that could not be undone. And in that moment, the story did not feel like it had ended, it felt like it had reset, aligned once again with the standard it was always meant to reflect. Danielle Carter did not look back as she moved through the lobby, not because she was ignoring what had happened, but because she had already faced it fully, and there was nothing behind her that required a second glance, nothing unfinished, nothing unresolved. The moment had been addressed with precision and it remained where it belonged. In the past, the doors ahead reflected her image briefly as she approached, a quiet mirror of someone who had not raised her voice, had not demanded attention, yet had shifted the entire space with nothing more than presence, clarity, and truth. And behind her, the lobby held its new form, not fragile, not temporary, but structured, like something that had been reset at its foundation rather than adjusted at the surface. Olivia remained at the desk, her posture steady, her focus forward, no longer reacting but operating, her hands moving with confidence as she continued managing the system that now reflected the standard Danielle had reinforced, and the remaining staff followed that same shift, quieter, more aware, not out of fear but out of understanding, because what had happened was not hidden, it had been witnessed, and that made it permanent in a way no policy ever could. A guest near the entrance stepped aside slightly as Danielle passed, not out of obligation but out of respect, and another gave a small nod, unspoken but clear, acknowledging not just who she was, but what she had done, and the significance of how she had done it, without chaos, without spectacle, without losing control for even a second. Outside, the light hit differently, brighter, open, unchanged by what had taken place inside, and yet Danielle carried the same calm presence into it, as if the transition from tension to clarity had always been part of the path she was walking, not an interruption, not an obstacle, just another moment where truth had to stand on its own. Behind the glass, the lobby continued, not watching her leave, but moving forward, as it should, with systems aligned, roles redefined, and a standard now visible in a way it had not been before. And that was the difference, not just correction, but visibility, not just consequence, but awareness. Danielle paused for the briefest moment just before stepping fully outside, not to reflect, not to reconsider, but to acknowledge something deeper, something that had followed her long before this building, long before this moment, a pattern she had seen in different forms, in different places, at different times, and each time it ended the same way, not with noise, not with argument, but with truth standing where assumption once did. And as she stepped forward into the open air, her voice, calm and unwavering, carried one final thought, not spoken loudly, not directed at anyone in particular, but present, nonetheless, clear enough to be understood by anyone willing to hear it. "I did not need to prove who I was," she said, her tone steady, certain. "I only needed to let you prove who you chose to be, and with that, she continued forward, leaving behind not just a corrected system, but a standard that would remain long after the moment itself had passed.